Next for presentation, we have the Wond'ry's Director of Making, Kevin Galloway, and I'll turn the presentation over to him.
For the next 25 minutes, I want to talk about a project that we've been working on with the Wond'ry, with Vice, and a lot of local partners in Nashville. And I was trying to figure out how best to describe this. And basically, this is going to be a story format, kind of going from how this started from a napkin sketch to a full prototype. But a little backstory. We were developing a low-cost ventilator. And for some of you who are unsure of what a ventilator is, it essentially is a machine that helps helps patients breathe. So if somebody has some sort of respiratory disease and can't breathe on their own, the ventilator takes over their breathing so that their body can heal and heal enough so that they can start breathing on their own. And as some of you are aware with the pandemic, one of the challenges of ventilators is that they're in short supply. I think an estimated need during a pandemic is that there would be a need for about 300,000 ventilators. And I think domestically we had about 100,000. So there has been this big rush to how do we get ventilators into the hands of the medical personnel so they have them when they need them. And another thing as we were exploring this project is, learning about ventilators, is that there are these manual type ventilators called bag valve resuscitators. And you've probably seen these in, the shows like ER and TV shows where they're running somebody down the hallway in a gurney and there's somebody squeezing this bag, trying to push air into the patient. And essentially that's what it does. It's like a short-term solution for helping a patient breathe. And what's interesting about these is that, generally they're on hand in large quantities. But there's been some really interesting stories learning about these. There was an article I read where there was a guy in India who had some sort of disease and could not breathe on his own. But he was in such a remote part of the area that his family started using the bag valve resuscitator. And he at one point became completely paralyzed, and family members took shifts squeezing this bag for 2 weeks to keep this person alive, and until they could get him to an actual ventilator. And a month later, he was completely recovered. But when I read that story, I was amazed that there are all these sophisticated machines. But at the end of the day, something as simple as this could keep somebody alive for a long period of time. So that is kind of was the motivation for this project. We're looking at the most simple, the least expensive way that you could push air into a patient's lungs, and the most complex. And then where could we fall somewhere in between, where we could be much better than the bag valve resuscitator, but not as nearly as complex or as expensive as a traditional ICU mechanical ventilator. So we're kind of in the sweet spot in our design, where we're essentially trying to replace the actuator, which is the human hand, and the controller, which is our brain, with a mechanism that can work reliably, continuously. It doesn't get tired. And something where you can control the key functional requirements. And these are ones that we derive from our physician collaborators during this entire project. You want to be able to control the volume of air you're pushing into a person, the I to E ratio, which is the inspiration to expiration ratio. So interesting, I didn't know any of this before I started this, but about 1/3 of your breathing cycle is breathing in, and then 2/3 of your cycle is breathing out. So as you design a system, you want to make sure that you allow 2/3 of that cycle for the patient to breathe out. You want to also be able to control the breaths per minute. So how fast is this thing being squeezed? And then have some safety mechanisms in place, like a pressure sensor, to make sure you're not over pressuring the lungs. So the story here begins, how did we go from a napkin sketch to parts on hand to make 100 units in about 5 weeks? And for me, it started on March 17th. Spencer Turney, who's with Vanderbilt Media Relations, reached out to me and said, can you comment on the movement to build open source ventilators? And my response was, what's an open source ventilator? There was a posting on Hackaday where there's clearly, as you can see, a movement to create low-cost ventilators. And that got me intrigued. I started reading user forums and seeing what people were saying. And one thing I saw kind of emerging with some of the solutions is that there were these high-cost motors, like very expensive motors and materials that were being used. And a lot of these were more in university environments. They were using laser cutters, CNC machines, materials that they had available. But at that moment, I was kind of restricted from using our makerspace. So I started looking around, what could I do in my own garage? And one of the things that popped up in me in some of the user forums is somebody said, why don't you just use a windshield wiper motor? And that got the wheels churning, because when you think of windshield wiper motors, you know, these are things that are designed to last 100,000 miles. So they're designed to operate in extreme environments. They're designed to be able to apply large loads, because you have windshield wipers that could be, you know, pushing snow or large volumes of rain. So I started thinking, how could I use a windshield wiper motor to squeeze the ambu bag? So a few days later, I had this idea for a first idea of what this could look like. And the final solution looks nothing like this. But basically, you have a windshield wiper motor here on the base of the wall, attached to the crank arm. And then this is nylon webbing, the same stuff you have on your backpack straps, that would just wrap around the ambu bag. And then you turn the motor on and it just rotates around. And then you'd have some electronics and some intelligence to be able to control how much you're squeezing the bag and at the rate and all those things. And literally the next day, Bob Webster, you know, this is, you know, we were kind of working in parallel, but didn't know about it. Bob was reached out to his physician collaborator for his startup company, Duke Carroll at the medical center. And this is like a summarized conversation of what these phone calls look like. But Bob basically said, Duke basically said, Bob, we could run out of ventilators in Nashville. You know, people could die. Is there anything we can do? And keep in mind, this is March 21st, so this is still early days, and we weren't really quite sure how things would roll out. So Bob said, let me look into it. Bob reached out to Eric Barth, who's in the mechanical engineering department, and Bob is also in the mechanical engineering department here at Vanderbilt. You know, he asked Eric, you know, what do you know about ventilators? Eric said, pretty much, you know, when I know a little bit, but Kevin put a sketch on the Slack page that we had set up a few days earlier. So Bob called me and I said, I've got sort of a concept. I was going to go buy the parts at O'Reilly Auto Parts that afternoon. And Bob came over that afternoon. We put this prototype together in a couple hours. And really it was just trying to prove the idea that you could use a windshield wiper motor, that it had enough force to be able to squeeze the ambu bag. And the little blue balloon there is supposed to be the lung. So it's just demonstrating that it's pushing air out. So that was March 21st. A couple days later, I refined the design, completely changed the entire mechanism, looking around online to get more inspiration, and settled on a Scotch yoke mechanism. So this is a simple mechanism for converting rotary motion into linear motion. So you can see the little, well, you can't see it now, but you can see this green pin rotating around, and the blue piece here is the linear motion. So, and this is the piece that we're using to squeeze the ambu bag. And you know, this prototype again took a couple hours. Used the same windshield wiper motor. I had drawer glides left over from a past project, and basically put this thing together to demonstrate that you could squeeze the ambu bag. But this one had a few more features to you know, enable a physician to be able to control with a lot more precision how much they were squeezing the bag. So you can move this mechanism backward or forward to be able to adjust the volume of air you're pushing into a patient. So this was March 23rd. The next day, we got on a call. Duke and Bob Webster started putting a physician team together. So Matthew Bichetta, who's in the Department of Thoracic Surgery, and Fabian Maldonado, also in the thoracic surgery. They brought their clinical expertise to really tell us, what are the main functional requirements that we would need. Interesting backstory on Matt. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan in the Army, so he was very familiar with how do you operate in austere environments. So his level of comfortability of what is good enough was hugely helpful in this process because he understood what would be the minimal requirements that he would need in order to be able to trust to put this on a patient. So we met with the doctors. Literally the next day, we got into one of the teaching labs in the medical center. This is an instrumented mannequin that you can see here. You can see the same prototype that was on my workbench in the garage. We put the ambi bag in place and basically trying to get that feedback from the physicians early on. What are the key features that you would want in the next prototype? Is this thing pushing enough air into the patient? Is it good enough? And interesting, as part of this project, the big red thing back there, that's a pig lung. So we were able to plug that into some more biological tissue just to see how the device performed. 2 days later, we took the feedback from physicians, made the entire assembly smaller. I got smaller drawer glides, which helped, and added more features to hold the ambi bag in place. And another thing you'll see here in the back here is a lead screw. This is essentially a carriage bolt you can buy from Home Depot. I turned this into a lead screw, and this allowed us to be able to control with a lot more precision how much this ambi bag was being squeezed. In the previous prototype, you had to loosen bolts and slide stuff back. And we were told by the doctors, we needed to make that a little bit better. So again, taking that feedback early as you can, so that way you can make more informed design decisions. Josh Gafford, who's a postdoctoral research fellow with Bob Webster, he has been part of this project from the very beginning. He took the lead on the electronics and essentially putting the intelligence onto the system. So that way the doctors could control all of these important features and how this device works. So this is the first mock-up of what the whole control interface looks like. And one thing you'll see here, I think if you can see with my cursor, this is a little L bracket here that's on the part of the yoke that moves back and forth. And these are just limit switches here. So there's, in robotics and control and motor designs and controls, there's this the tendency that you want to know precisely where the motor is at every moment of its cycle. But as we thought about this particular project, really we just needed to know when was the yoke at its two extremes in the stroke cycle. So we could have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to put a rotary encoder or something onto this device to be able to measure where the yoke was in its cycle. But really, we just need to know when was it at max squeeze of the ambi bag and when was it fully retracted. So this hugely simplified the whole process of controlling this device to be able to control the breaths per minute, the inspiration-expiration ratio, and all those features. And then April 3rd, so a few days later, we got permission to do our first animal study. So here we're really kicking the tires on this device to see, could this keep a person alive? So in our first animal study, we discovered some issues, not so much with the device, but more with the tubing. We can see here, there's a lot of dead volume in this tube here. So we had to go back to the drawing board and figure out how our tubing solution was going to work. And that basically the tubing disrupted some of the safety features of PEEP valves and things in this device. So we went back to the drawing board. We found a single circuit tubing that's used primarily for patients who are getting an MRI exam, so that the medical professional could be off on the side, squeezing the ambi bag when somebody's in the huge MRI, and essentially found an off-the-shelf solution that would work for our project here. We came back 5 days later for our next animal study, and this kept the pig alive for 4 hours, and pretty much it could have gone longer, but people have more things to do. So for the doctors, you know, this was the defining moment. At this point, they told us, you know, we would be comfortable enough if in the worst case scenario, there were no other options, we would put a patient on this device. So at that point, we froze the design. We said, all right, the design's good enough. Let's start making 100 of these. So through our collaborators in the greater Nashville area, we made a connection with Able McAllister Able. They're a stage production company. They don't make medical equipment. But what they did have was this huge 5 foot by 10 foot CNC router, where I've been making all the mechanical parts of this project in my wood shop. It takes a couple hours to put it together. But when you start to scale to 100, that's a lot of wood. I think this was 33 sheets of plywood in all. So with their CNC router, we were able to ramp up production very quickly. We could do pretty much enough parts for 3 units from a single sheet of plywood in 45 minutes. And what I found fascinating about this part of the project is, you know, one, I never make 100 of something. Usually in research, you make 1 or 2 or 3, and you know, you collect the data, you write the research paper, you put the grant together, and you move on to the next thing. But when you start thinking of how do you scale production, you know, you had to be much more careful of, you know, how are we maximizing the use of the materials. But I think the more fascinating part was, once we had really figured out the design file, literally you could send anybody who has a CNC router the design file for this, and they could become a medical ventilator manufacturer in minutes. You know, all they have to do is throw a sheet of plywood down, push go on the file, and they are making ventilators. So when we start thinking of how local economies could address, you know, local challenges, you know, we're starting to really figure out this recipe of how we could distribute this very quickly without having to worry about how everything is going to be co-located in one manufacturing plant, and then how do we transport all of that stuff around the world. So as part of this, we really started, we'd already developed a team of volunteers, but we really started developing a larger team of volunteers. So this is Joe and Margaret, grad students in the mechanical engineering department. They got recruited to do a lot of drilling of pocket holes. Margaret here, I think did 2,500 pocket hole drills over 3 days. And Joe did a lot of sanding and attaching of metal plates. And here's just one rack of parts here on the right for the devices. And there was another huge pallet of stuff, and then another couple carloads to get it all together. But you know, this would not have been possible without the support from Able McAllister Able. They committed, you know, 3 days of their time and materials to putting this together. So we would not be where we are right now without the support from them. After we got all the parts, I was in discussions with Fort Houston, which is a makerspace in the Wedgwood, Houston area. If anybody's familiar with like Wedgwood, where Wedgwood and I-65 kind of intersect, Fort Houston is right next to there. They had a 5,000 square foot event space that was sitting empty because nobody's having events. So we turned this into the assembly area. So what was great about this is we had plenty of room. We could set up tables, we could have the proper social distancing, and everybody could be working on a subsystem assembly of this device. So you can see here in the bottom left, We're starting to put the Scotch yoke mechanism together. We're doing some gluing of spacers onto here, more assembly of Scotch yoke, working on parts for the cradle. We got somebody here on the bottom right working on the lead screw for controlling how much the empty bag gets squeezed. So starting to put all these pieces together. And then by April 18th, we were starting to get these systems fully assembled. So this was like the first fully assembled one. We, in parallel, another group of folks were assembling control boxes, because this takes some time to solder the wires together, load up the program. And so here we're just demoing what the finished product looks like. And then by April 27th, we started shifting all of these units over to the Wond'ry. This is the first batch of about 35 of them at the Wond'ry. All of them have now been moved over. So we have 100 low-cost ventilators sitting on the second floor of the Wond'ry. So if you are walking by, you'll see a colorful display of pool noodles and a lot of boxes. What's next for this project? A couple weeks ago, we filed with the FDA, the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization. And this essentially is asking the FDA permission to share more of this project in this design with other folks. It would give us permission to ship these units to others to evaluate. We're working on the finishing touches on assembly. Another interesting thing is really there's been a lot of interest in low-cost ventilators now, so we're trying to explore funding opportunities to do more advanced studies. We did kind of like the minimal with an animal study, but trying to look at more injured lung models and things where a patient would be in worse condition, and how could the device help them through that. And then I think one of the amazing things about this whole project is kind of the outpouring of support and interest in this from the very beginning. We got some local news coverage, and that is reached all corners of the world. We were getting emails from people all over the USA, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Australia, Philippines, India, Kenya. I guess Australia is listed twice, and Syria and Turkey. As soon as we get this EUA in place, I really want to reconnect with these partners and see how this solution could enable their local economies to be able to be ready for the worst case scenario. For the last part of the slide here, just want to acknowledge the contributors I have been able to record. I know there are more that have been involved in this project, but these are the ones that I was able to dig up in all my emails last night at 11 o'clock. And so, if anybody's watching, I just want to say thank you for all of your help in helping us get where we are right now. Michael, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, you have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? All right.
Yeah.
I just want to tie this back to Dive a little bit. So I'm the faculty director of Dive, which is Design as an Immersive Vanderbilt Experience. And Dave was talking about, this innovation process. What's this all about? How's this tie with immersion and Dive? And human-centered design is basically the problem-solving process. It's designed to get you to learn from people, expand your creative possibilities, and zero in on what's desirable, feasible, and viable for your audience. And there's a lot of mindsets, and one that we really want to highlight about this project is that or a couple is it's collaborative, and it's experimental, and and that I think those are two things that really came out of this project. It took a team to put all of this stuff together, and we had to try things quickly. Kind of being under this kind of in crisis mode, you had to make decisions very quickly. There's no time for second guessing. But it also it forces the team to be in a high operational tempo, where people are putting things together, getting things done, asking questions and answering them as quickly as possible, so that way we can make informed decisions and move on to the next phase of the design. And this is what we're trying to teach students to do as part of their academic careers, and something we want them to carry with them professionally. And I don't know if Dave talked about the whole design process, but it begins with empathy. It's about understanding the context and challenges of the problem. You know, we talked to the doctors early on to understand what are your needs, you know, what are the conditions in which this disease presents, and, you know, what are the minimal functional requirements that a device would need to be able to do in order to help you. And then from that, we were able to, you know, define, you know, those functional requirements, brainstorm different ways of solving it, prototype quickly, and then test. And you could see we did lots of different tests, and, you know, in each test we learned something new and tried to figure out how to solve it and iterated through the design. And, you know, this is stuff I teach in my own class, how to make almost anything and make it matter. And really focusing on the prototyping and the testing, but really this entire innovation process of, you know, going out and talking to people early, and really understand, you know, how do you design impactful solutions? It begins with really understanding, you know, the user and what matters to that person. Whoops, sorry, I forgot to advance through there. So these are the different phases. And you know, one thing I just really try to emphasize to all my students is that this is just a process. You know, if you trust the process, you'll have a higher probability of converging on a solution, and a solution that will have impact. So that's all I've got.
All right. Do we have any questions for Kevin?
I mean, I've got a quick question for Kevin. What would you say was the most like unsuspecting challenge that you faced in this process? Like something you didn't think would happen, but ended up informing your design process?
I'm not sure. It was, most of it was pretty, what do I want to say? I think probably the most interesting thing, or part of the whole process, was designing with these kind of extreme conditions. So really trying to design without a CNC machine or a laser cutter, and trying to think of what are the bare minimum manufacturing tools that somebody would have in the most remote part of the world, and, you know, could they use those tools in order to put this device together. So that was kind of a challenge. It really required a lot of MacGyvering and thinking like, well, how could they really do this? And you know, the CNC router that we borrowed time on from Abel McAllister Abel helped to ramp up production, but the entire design could be made with a table saw and a drill press and some electronics on the side, but the mechanical part could be made with a table saw and a drill press.
All right, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Kevin. So if we have any more questions, we have about a minute left.
So not a question necessarily, Kevin, but I've gotten to be just involved with, you know, some updates on the project, but it was really, really amazing to see how the sausage was made on all of this. It's fantastic.
Thank you. There were a lot of 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. Hours, because that was the only time to get work done when my 3-year-old was asleep. As soon as I step into the garage, she wants to help, which is not helping, unfortunately, yet. A few more years.
Kevin, do you have an IKEA assembly manual for it yet?
Yeah, we've got a first draft of it together, and since we've updated a few things, I need to go back and redo the photo shoot of some of these parts and add the descriptions in there. But yeah, we've got materials together. And I forgot to mention, you know, there is a site, vandevents.com. That is being updated. We're going to be moving it behind vanderbilt.edu, probably under the Wond'ry soon. But if you do vandevents.com at any time, it should direct you to wherever those materials are located.